Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. So here's the question. What do Wisconsin's Republican politicians, the political aftermath of 9/11, the Wall Street banking crash, and the federal budget crisis all have in common? In each case, a crisis, either real or contrived, was used as the excuse to impose preconceived agendas of radical right-wing economic policies upon our political and or our economic lives. In 2007, Naomi Klein published a powerful book called The Shock Doctrine, and we'll use the ideas from that and build upon them during this program. The book is 600 pages long, but very readable. A lot of substance, a lot of good information and insights, and she does an excellent job of connecting the dots between a lot of things that have gone on in the past few decades and are going on right now in today's newspaper headlines. The book explodes the myth that the global free market triumphed democratically. Naomi Klein's book exposes the thinking, the money trail, and the puppet strings behind world-changing crises and wars in the past 4 decades. The preferred method has been to use either natural crises or other severe crises caused by humans, and to exploit the suffering people and the nations by imposing radical free market policies upon them and stripping away the public sector and stripping away people's democratic rights. The Shock Doctrine book connects the dots and it explains the underlying ideology that drove a number of actions. The radical free market ideology drove the Nixon and Kissinger coup that overthrew Chile's democracy in 1973. It drove the economic vultures who pillaged Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. It drove George W. Bush's 2003 war against Iraq. It drove Bush's negative actions in response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And that same free market ideology also underlies our nation's current financial crisis, underlies the Wisconsin governor's current mania for busting unions, and it underlies the Republicans' drive to privatize Social Security and Medicare. This same ideology has been driving a wider wedge between the rich and the poor. Extremely rich individuals and businesses have been getting richer than ever, while the middle class has been slipping and the people at the bottom end have been just devastated. So we're going to connect all these dots. There's a lot going on. We have a richly informative program, and we have 2 very well-informed and insightful guests who have read the book and are very much in touch with all of these issues. We have Molly Gibbs and Larry Kirshner. I'm happy to have both of you on the show. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we will be able to share a lot of information with the viewers. To start with, Larry, could you just outline the basic sense of this economic radical free market stuff, Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics? It's often referred to just as the Chicago School.
Yeah, it started, well, I think there's an Austrian economist named Hayek, and his ideas were taken up by Milton Friedman, and it suffused the was University of Chicago or Chicago University School of Economics, and they have this basic belief that there are certain underlying immutable economic principles that will always occur unless people somehow interfere with them. And they think the three main ways that these economic ideas get interfered with is if the government creates social programs, if the government tries in any way to inhibit or regulate corporations, and if the government tries to own economic entities that could be owned by the private corporations. And so those three things together in one form or another, they think that's what interferes with the natural order of things. So their whole focus is to get rid of those three things.
Right. And that's what we've been seeing in this country and other countries around the world. We've seen this as the government has sort of bought into that set of theories, and they've been deregulating.
Right.
They deregulated the banks, so the banks could do all kinds of screwy things, which later ended up crashing our economy. And they've been trying to privatize Social Security, now trying to privatize Medicare, sell off state prisons, sell off the state liquor stores in Washington State. And all over they've been using school vouchers, trying to push school vouchers to undermine public education, and now they're trying to bust the unions. And then they do all these free trade things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and WTO, the World Trade Organization, to eliminate any ways for countries to protect their own industries or to protect worker rights or to take care of the environment. So like you say, they want to strip away all that.
Because that's interfering with the natural economic laws that are God-given somehow.
Yeah.
And we just need to get out of the way of those.
So could we lay out some of the main points in Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine?
Oh, there's so many.
There's so many, and we'll get into them through the program. I wonder if we can just hit a couple here at the outset, and then we'll fill in the gaps as we go.
Well, I was just thinking about Israel and the examples where she talks about how if there is any kind of disaster, then there's an opportunity. And that's a basic principle that she follows in terms of the Chicago Boys approach. So if there's the opportunity, I was thinking of with the Lebanon War, actually in terms of what Israel did, they experienced the dot-com crash. Most of their economy was very focused on technology. They were incredible, high-tech, culture. So when the dot-com crash came, it also was just this opportunity then to move into homeland security. And I think this is, very typical of what happens. If there's any kind of crisis, be it a natural disaster, as Sri Lanka was such an example
with the tsunami,
yes,
and Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, which we'll talk about.
Right.
Right. I think that what they do is they realize that in the midst of crisis, people tend to think short term and are looking, what is it that I need to get to the next day? And Milton Friedman said that their role is to have all these plans ready to roll out no matter what the crisis is. And they roll them out in the midst of people who are in shock and awe and can be confused about the implications, and these people take advantage of that. And they claim that whatever it is that they're rolling out is meant to deal with whatever the particular crisis is. But in most cases, it actually has nothing to do with what the crisis is. It's just another way to get their ideology
Yeah.
in place
Right.
so that they can take control of the natural wealth of people.
I'm curious about, just for a minute, to look at Katrina. And as someone observing and totally horrified by the lack of action, especially from the government, it was very horrific to watch days and days go by without any response to immediate needs for food, for shelter. And that was actually quite deliberate.
Right. Yeah. People thought this is Bush being incompetent. It actually was his agenda.
Exactly.
Right.
Was the government should not help
Intervene.
people.
Right.
The government should not help
Right.
people. You take advantage of that crisis to roll out those
Exactly.
policies, and so they demolished public housing, including public housing that had not been damaged by the
Yeah.
hurricane.
Right.
Right.
And they wiped out the public school system, and they went
Charter.
to charter schools, and so they were able to destroy the teachers union and
You remember,
all of that
you
stuff.
remember everybody was aghast when Bush said to the head of FEMA, "Good job, Brownie."
Yeah.
And everybody thought, what is he talking about?
Yeah.
But in fact, he meant what he said
Yeah.
Yeah.
because they had done exactly what
They were
was
supposed to.
prescribed
Which
by
was-
this
which was nothing.
crisis capitalism.
And then what they've done now
Right.
in the lower Ninth Ward and these other areas that had been black and poor is they wiped all that and they're rebuilding it for white, rich tourists.
Right.
So it's all gentrification, and it's so they're getting what they wanted out
Right,
of it.
right. Milton Friedman himself looked at Katrina and said, "What a great opportunity
Opportunity.
we have here."
Yeah.
They saw that as
Right.
as an
So
opportunity.
part of one of the recurring themes here that we'll probably be talking about is they like to have some kind of a catastrophe, some kind of a disaster. In fact, her subtitle here is about disaster capitalism. They like to have some kind of a disaster so they can have a clean slate. And so you, like with Katrina, they just bulldozed as much of New Orleans as they felt like. And in Iraq, they destroyed as much as they possibly could so they could have a clean slate and rebuild.
Well, I like to especially Iraq, I always like to emphasize that the way this sort of capitalism works is it's destroy, rebuild, destroy, rebuild. It's
Yeah.
cyclical, and that's
Right.
built into it. So corporations get incredibly wealthy
Right.
because money may be lost, may be missing. They bomb everything right down to nothing again, and then the companies benefit because they get to rebuild it.
And it's the same companies.
Right.
So,
Right.
so many of these companies that are doing the quote rebuilding, Halliburton and these others, are actually war profiteers. They're supplying the war,
Yep.
and they're also supplying the rebuilding, so that they're in at both ends,
Right.
and they just cycle it through. Can you tell us something about Chile? Chile has a long history of democracy until Salvador Allende, who was elected in a full, free, fair election, wanted to make sure that the people of Chile derived the benefits from their mineral riches. They have great copper mines and other mineral riches, instead of having the United States suck
Yeah.
the wealth out of there.
They had 140 years
Yeah,
of
it was
democratic
amazing.
government, and then the other September 11th, which was September 11th, 1973,
Yeah.
the Pinochet and the Chilean army
Yeah,
at the
General Pinochet
General
from-
Pinochet at the behest of the CIA and
Nixon.
corporate, Kissinger and Nixon and that
Yeah,
bunch.
and the CIA and
then
ITT.
ITT
Environmental
and
Corporation.
Codelco and the other big corporations, they were so offended by Allende's idea that maybe the government should do something for the people. They portrayed him as this Marxist radical, but what he was talking about was similar to what goes on in Norway and Sweden and some of those countries.
Yeah.
That's the level of Marxism that he was
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about doing, but it so offended these people that they generated a lot of anti-communist hysteria in the Chilean army,
Yeah.
and they brought all of these economic Chicago boys with an economic plan ready to go.
Right, they had that all written up in
It was all
advance,
written up.
and all they had to do is create a blank slate and impose it.
Right.
And the So that was ready to roll, just like we were saying. They have all
Right.
queued up, and then the coup was done partly through the Chilean army, and partly from the CIA, and partly the United States government. The Nixon administration had gotten U.S. and other banks to shut down
Right.
lending to the
Right.
civilian economy to create a crisis. Meanwhile, ratcheted up massively U.S. aid to the Chilean military.
Right.
So it was all behind the scenes stuff.
Right.
And then when the people of Chile were upset, which rightfully so, they hauled tens of thousands of them into like big soccer stadiums, and they tortured people, and they slaughtered people, and they just had this horrible repression that went on for many years.
Yeah, I think Pinochet was in charge 17 years.
Yeah, I think something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing case study, and that was the first time that whole Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman approach to economics was
Right.
put out there.
And if you just look at it with just what we just said, there's a lot of people who claim it was a triumph of capitalism.
Yeah.
But what they don't talk about was the fact that when Allende was first elected, the unemployment rate in Chile was 3%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the time they were done with about 4 years of this disaster capitalism, the unemployment rate was 30%. The hyperinflation had destroyed any hope for savings or anything in the country. It totally ruined the country, but there was a small percentage of the very wealthy who got even more wealthy,
Right.
picking the bones out of the economy.
That's
Middle
the
class,
common
poor got
Right.
totally
denominator.
devastated.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So the picture was shown. This was wonderful economy, but it was only a wonderful economy for those very rich at the top.
We see that again and again. That is the pattern.
Right.
It's reading that, I think, was the most horrifying experience. To think that thousands of people were just slaughtered. It's just beyond belief that that was perfectly acceptable, and there was no accountability. And this has continued and continued in so many countries. My overriding response to reading that a few years ago is an underlying uncomfortable belief that that's what's coming here.
There's a pattern where they do some of these things in other countries, and if they get away with it, then they bring it home.
Right.
And
Yes,
we're seeing
yes.
some
Yeah,
of that.
it's like an experiment out there,
Yeah.
and then they bring it
I
home.
think it's important to make, we're talking about connecting the dots. I think it's real important to be looking at the FBI repression, the people. We have a wonderful man in our community. They keep trying to deport him. Some ridiculous agenda behind that, I'm sure. But we are seeing, since the Patriot Act, we are just seeing more and more infringements upon our own
Yeah.
security. And when we look at, this whole business, the business that has kept the Israeli economy flourishing is all based on numerous different ways with wonderful Orwellian titles to create systems. They're purchased around the world.
Right.
People globally, Canada, Britain, all over the world, countries buy these systems to protect
Right.
their
It's
corporations.
surveillance
Yep.
cameras, computers that will kind of take a look at your eyes and find out if
Facial
you're
recognition
a terrorist or
systems,
not.
yeah.
Just
all
this,
kinds of stuff
just
like
this
that.
morning, what was it? Verizon? No, Apple. You buy a iPhone, and the iPhone tracks wherever you are.
Yeah.
And it for at least a year. It's a year program for at least 1 year. You buy one of those, and you're going to be followed everywhere.
So this pattern of the economics they did in Chile has been repeated in a number of places. I think people watching the program might remember what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia and other countries spun off as independent countries. And in Russia, all their state-owned
Right.
businesses got privatized. They got sold
Right.
off, and the people who bought them were the people who were politically connected. So it was old Russian big shots who became super capitalists.
Right.
And they made billions and billions of dollars, and the ordinary people of Russia were just plunged into poverty.
Right.
There's massive
Unemployment, alcoholism.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
all that stuff is
Yeah.
worse. But the super rich, and in that case, it was like the Chicago School of Economics, but these have to be consultants from Harvard University.
Right.
That the United States sent there. So the United States did that in the guise of bringing democracy to
Democracy.
Russia.
Oh,
but it
yes.
was not democracy,
Right.
it was about capitalism.
Right, exactly.
And it's just devastating to that country.
When you look at this, it makes some of the things you see happen in history make more sense.
Yeah.
I think of the Polish solidarity. The workers in Poland
Yeah.
rose up and threw out that whole system. And then you look at Poland a few years later, and it's basically crushed. And you look at
Yeah.
South Africa.
Right.
Same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good one.
They were rising up. The wonderful opportunities. A few years later, it's crushed, and it's because the bankers and the capitalists
Right.
got in there.
Yeah,
What-
they
what
just wait for
control.
and create the economic downturn.
Yeah.
And boy,
And-
South Africa was
Right,
just
they did that in both of these
immediate.
places where progressive people got elected,
Yeah.
but the economy had been so much undermined before they got
Right.
into
Right.
office that at that point they were saddled with debt,
Right.
and they were stuck. And then it was the remnants of the Solidarity
Right.
Union, and it was the ANC that got stuck with doing the privatization and stuff,
Well,
and then they betrayed the people who had put them there.
Right. The
Yeah.
current president of South Africa is named Mbeki.
Yeah.
He was the one who'd made the deals with the banks.
And they,
Thanks.
and they
that-
didn't know what was going on.
And they, Mandela and
Yeah.
the rest of them were
Right.
worried about, are we going to be able to vote?
Yeah.
Where Mbeki's here selling the country to
Right.
the bankers, and now he's the president.
Yeah.
That's
And-
that's an interesting point, because to have our own governmental structure in place, if we're not able to fully carry out a complete program when disaster hits here, we'll lose everything.
Well, I mean, look what happened. There was no such thing as Homeland Security
Yeah.
companies in this country
It went
before
from
2011,
0 to
and it's over 250 billion.
Billion
now.
dollars,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And it's all privatized.
Right.
It's not the government doing this. It's private companies
Right.
doing this with our tax dollars.
But the government is trying to privatize things and take stuff out of, like, Rumsfeld was behind
Right.
this, Bush's Secretary of Defense. His whole approach and Cheney's whole approach was you privatize as much of the military as you can, turn it over to private companies
Right.
and contract everything out. And they know it doesn't save money. It costs more. These
Costs more
Blackwater
money. Oh, way
people are
more.
very expensive
Right.
to hire, and they're doing things that soldiers used to do at a lower price. So it's not about saving money. It's
Right.
just the whole philosophy that they want to
It's
privatize.
privatized.
And so these companies are making money just because they're private companies.
Right.
And in many cases, it's the same people involved. It's the same
Halliburton
government big
and-
shots that are doing
Right.
this. And
They wanted
rotate it around.
to restructure the military, so the only thing that wasn't being privatized was the opportunity to get killed.
Yeah.
Everything else
Yeah,
was
yeah.
up for the
Right.
bid.
And so to look at your
without bidding.
examples from Poland and South Africa and a bunch of other countries, what we need to do in this country is recognize that we need economic democracy
Right.
in addition to political democracy.
Exactly.
And what we have is we have sort of a political democracy, except elections are sold to the highest bidder.
I don't think we do
Because
anymore.
we can't have campaign finance reform. But we have a little bit of political democracy, but we have very little economic democracy. And when they put this out for public consumption in the news media or politicians' speeches and the rhetoric, it's like, oh, we're going to bring democracy to those countries. And we're not. We're bringing capitalism
Exactly.
in that very harsh, brutal
Shock
kind
doctrine.
with the shock doctrine and all of that.
Right, and they're not even true to their own principles. They say they want the free market, but really what they want is the government. I think I read somewhere, maybe in this book, somewhere else, they want the government to act as a venture capitalist.
Yes.
For their programs. They don't want true free market.
Right.
They don't want, because they know that if the people wouldn't put up with this in a true market
Right.
situation.
Well, a lot of these are not competitive bids.
No.
There's a huge amount in Iraq and elsewhere, and we'll talk about Iraq in a couple of minutes, a huge amount of that, and these current things are sole source. It's like, I want my friend in this company
Right.
to get the contract, so I'll just give it to them, worth billions of dollars, and there's no competition.
Right.
There's no free market.
And there's no
It's,
bidding.
It's
Yeah,
all
yeah.
it's all government
Yeah.
subsidy,
Yeah.
so it's not free market at all. It's very intense cronyism. And we've seen these patterns of how the third world countries for a number of decades were getting into debt because they have a dictator who would borrow money and spend it on his lavish stuff, stick the people with the debt, and then when the people finally rise up throughout the dictator, those people are saddled
They're
with the
stuck
debt.
with the debt, yeah.
And then World Bank and International Monetary Fund come in with these austerity programs.
Right.
Well, okay, we'll restructure your debt, but you got to close down your schools. You got to stop subsidizing grain and other food products. You got to cut back on healthcare costs. And I mean,
Yeah, the three principal things that the
Right.
Chicago School.
It's-
But if you look back historically, the UN, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were all started roughly at the same time,
Yeah.
at the end of the Second World War. The UN was started to give nations a way of talking together short of war, solve their problems. The World Bank was created to invest in poor countries to help raise them out of poverty. And the International Monetary Fund was created to act as kind of an economic buffer so that there wouldn't be great fluctuations in valuation of currencies and those sort of things. So they were all three were started with great
Intentions.
hope and intentions, but the United States basically dominates the UN and makes it do whatever it wants, and the World Bank and the IMF have been taken over by the people who believe in this, and so they, like you say, they will run up debts, and then if that last dictator goes out for whatever reason, the people of the country are stuck with the debts.
We're running a bit late, but I want to make sure that we get plenty of time to deal with Iraq. You had done some really great research. You put together a series of slides and some principles. I want to just lay out a bit of background for people. Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with the attacks on September 11. But right after those attacks, Dick Cheney said, "Oh, we have to go to war against Iraq." And people went, "What? What's going on?" You know, it must be coveting thy neighbor's oil.
War for oil.
But that's part of it, and the rest of it is what you're going to be telling us about. Tell us about what Dick Cheney's motives were beyond the oil, and the rest of the agenda for this. So let's talk that through.
I think the agenda for Iraq was all about privatization. Again, the capitalism certainly had nothing to do with democracy. So what happened was they sent Paul Bremer to bring about complete change. And I think it's important to note that Iraq had the most wonderful medical system. Larry and I were talking about this earlier. People from all over the Middle East would go to Iraq for health care. They also had a free education system, and it went all the way through university. Everyone got a free education.
And they had women's equality. A huge number of women were doctors, engineers,
Yes, well
leaders in
educated
all
and
kinds of ways.
professionals.
Women had real equality there, but not anymore.
Well, I mean, the ways in which we've destroyed that country are just beyond belief. So some people are very aware that for 10 years prior to this war, we had already killed millions of Iraqis, and much of that came about through the first Gulf War.
And the sanctions.
Yeah, the
economic
sanctions
sanctions.
were deadly. How many? A million children?
Roughly a million, yeah.
So on top of that atrocity, we set about sending Mr. Bremer in, and Bremer's one of many who should be imprisoned for what he did.
And he was Bush's appointee from the Coalition Provisional Authority. the temporary
CPA.
government. And basically what Bush had done is he appointed him basically to be the dictator over Iraq. There was no democracy whatsoever.
Right.
He could make up the laws. He could make the decisions, and what he said goes. He was pretty much the absolute dictator over
So
Iraq.
what I was going to describe about Bremer, he did that through orders. There were at least 100 orders, and then there were memoranda beyond that. But what the guy did was he, in about 2 weeks, he did most of the unraveling of the government. And then within the next 5 to 6 months, he completely destroyed the government from top to bottom. So the first order that was in place was called the de-Baathification of Iraqi society, and it was extraordinarily stupid and short-sighted.
And this is referring to the Ba'ath Party, which was Saddam Hussein's
Yeah, I'll
party.
explain.
You got that, okay.
Yeah. So the idea, he did this under the guise of destroying the party that Saddam Hussein had led. And under that guise, he took away the top 3 layers of the government. So all of the hospital personnel, university personnel were wiped out. And 120,000 very critical professionals were laid off. So you think about people who are essential to running your sewage, your water, your electricity, skilled laborers, very critical people were all laid off. And the Ba'athist loyalty, was used to manipulate the people to mask the real goal of privatization. We know that Iraq lost not only water and electricity in their power systems, they lost the way to access the people who knew how to keep them going, and that's really critical. So it was interesting, 5 months later, it was such a disaster, Bremer was forced to amend that first order. And what he then did was he created like Order 94, and he did a case-by-case review. So he desperately needed people to come back and fill those positions, but he did it on a case-by-case basis. I mean, this feels so familiar to me. This is just the way things would be happening here. The second order was the dissolution of the Iraqi army. And this was really just as stupid. One of I think the fellow who spoke out was an assistant or a deputy ambassador from the Defense Intelligence Agency here. And he said that originally all of the military was to have continued receiving their pay, and they were not to lose their pay. And he said, the analyst said, we should carefully screen the Iraqis because they would do the work much better than any U.S. force would. In other words, alluding already to the danger of having an occupying force. Just from the start, this is a stupid thing to do. So 500,000 men were laid off.
They were laid off and they were sent home with their guns.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yes, they were.
These guys, they got laid off, and they go home with their guns, and they're angry.
Right.
Right.
Does this sound like a problem coming?
Right. So the unemployment.
Why would the people?
Right, rebel?
Yeah.
Yeah, unemployment was 50 to 75%. So right now we have 20% unemployment. Think about 50% unemployment. This lack of viable Iraqi military was the justification for Bush to continue our U.S. military presence.
Right.
So that's critical. That's what we were about.
Yeah, so it's kind of a dog chasing the tail kind of thing, where we have to occupy the country and use violence because of the violence that we provoke.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
And
exactly.
the more we do it, the worse it gets.
The worse it gets.
So the more we have to do it.
The more we have to do it.
Right.
But that's the remedy that these Chicago
Exactly.
boys
Exactly.
have is when you have they go into a country and screw up their economy, and when things go bad, they prescribe more of the same. And they keep doing that in country after country, including in this country.
Exactly, because they can make a profit each time they do that.
Every time it gets worse, they make more money.
Exactly.
Just think
Yeah.
profit.
Yeah.
So Order 12 was the trade liberalization policy. And this suspended all tariffs, all customs, duties, taxes of any sort coming in to Iraq. So it was pretty amazing. There's just this inflow of cheap products, and it devastated local producers and sellers. the U.S. exported wheat and rice, and the guys here, the people here who were the head of the wheat and rice industries just zeroed in on grabbing that opportunity. And the prices that they sold wheat and rice were higher than prices here. And you have to realize that a critical part of Hussein's government was the people all received baskets with wheat, flour, the milled flour. If the farmers were all guaranteed a price for their wheat. And even if it wasn't a good crop, they would still grind. They'd make sure that every household had flour, sugar, tea, and other basic necessities. That's what had been taking place, and all of a sudden, not only was that all gone, they had huge prices that most people couldn't afford.
Right.
So 75% unemployment, and you can't eat.
Yeah.
So the U.S. provided technology and education. This is the kind of thing you'll hear from the Chicago boys. You know, we'll provide technology and education. I've heard it here from our own government agencies, state level.
Yeah.
We do technical advice, but we won't address the political issue.
Right.
We will not regulate. And this was just what was happening. It's similar to what the WTO did to the South Korean farmers. Remember all the farmers committing suicide?
Right.
This was very much in line with what they were doing. So it was identical to the deadly effects from the WTO, the World Bank, in India, Zambia, South Korea. And U.S. wheat exports went from 0 to 190 million in the first year in Iraq. And the farmers just couldn't compete. They were out of business. Order 14 was about media censorship, prohibits any criticism of the CPA, the Provisional Authority.
Which sort of undermines the notion that we were there to promote democracy.
Right.
When we had strict, absolute censorship.
Yeah.
Where's the democracy?
Yeah, any suggestion of return to the Iraq Ba'ath Party, you couldn't talk about anything. It was very critical because Muqtada al-Sadr had a major newspaper, and it was padlocked. You know, that's what Bremer's thugs would do. They'd go out and ransack places, and you know, if any newspaper, you know, had any article, anything against the Provisional Authority, they'd be ransacked, padlocked. And they shut down the newspapers. And then Order 17, I always remember as immunity to impunity. It granted full immunity from all Iraqi laws. So any corporation doing business now in Iraq, there would just be complete immunity from any Iraqi law. Diplomatic immunity applied to 150,000 U.S. soldiers and those who were serving at Abu Ghraib. You would remember, Larry. No soldier found guilty of committing illegal acts. So Abu Ghraib, I was thinking about that they couldn't be tried. They could no longer be tried by Iraqi courts.
Right.
And foreign contractors, of course, were free from income taxes. The 40th law, the bank law, allowed foreign banks to purchase up to 50% of an Iraqi bank. So Morgan Chase moved in, bought up a chain of 14 Iraqi banks, and 1 year later, any organization, corporation could go in and purchase 100% of Iraqi banks. So I think that's probably enough of...
Yeah.
Gives you the
it's
idea.
Amazing. And I know that you have other information because we looked at this before the program, but it just goes on and on and on, and you wonder, so why are the people mad at us? Why would they try to shoot at us? Why would they try to get us out of their country?
I was always struck by the fact that of all the laws that were on the books under Saddam Hussein, Bremer left one law in place. He got rid of every single other one. The one he left in place was to prevent people from forming unions. That was the only one he left on the line.
As we mentioned a few minutes back, A number of things that happen in other countries are sort of like experiments, and then they try and bring this home. And what we're seeing in this country is a lot of this radical free market mania, emphasis on school vouchers instead of our public schools that serve everybody, where the elite can do their thing. And they're trying again to privatize Social Security. The Republicans in the House are now trying to privatize Medicare, where instead of an efficient Medicare system, you get a voucher and you're thrown at the mercy of some insurance company, but your voucher won't pay the full cost. So they're going to bit by bit reduce the amount of support for your Medicare until you're just stuck, and the insurance companies can mess you around. And then the corporations can give, and rich people can give as much as they want on elections. So with the Citizens United decision, elections are sold to the highest bidder. That's a free market capitalism thing. And here in Washington State, they've been trying to privatize liquor stores. Now they're trying to privatize workers' compensation, which is a good, efficient, fair system. They've been trying to do that. They're still deregulating banks. The banks that were too big to fail are even bigger.
Right.
And there's been no effective regulation of the banks, and
no accountability.
Yeah, no accountability.
I think it's very frustrating to watch because here in this state, $5.2 billion could so easily be available through closing tax loopholes.
Right.
Simple.
And you wanted to talk about the wealth gap in this country.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Going back and looking at Chile and how the wealthy people there made out like bandits. One of the new words that I discovered in the Shock Doctrine book is plutonomy, and that's the economy of the super rich, and it's doing very well around the world.
Yachts, luxury,
luxury,
who own their own
planes and islands and that kind of stuff.
Trillions in the bank.
So the plutonomy is doing well,
Yeah.
but here in this country, there's 400 people who have more wealth than the bottom 150 million people. The United States is second in the world in terms of the discrepancy between the very rich and the very poor. Chile is eighth in the world.
Yeah, and they used to be way better.
And
they used to have a vibrant middle class.
They did. And the United States used to have a middle class, and we don't anymore. And it isn't an unintended consequence of it's being done deliberately.
Well, and yeah, they really don't need all these people at the bottom who are being squeezed out by the shredded safety net. These people are just unnecessary. We can get cheap labor from China and Indonesia and whatever else. China has now exceeded the United States in the number of General Motors cars being sold.
Right.
And General Motors is not making cars in the United States and shipping them to China. General Motors has factories in China to make cars there, and they do more of that than General Motors does in this country.
That's because China has bought into this whole thing.
Yeah, the communists become super capitalists.
The way that this works best is when you have an authoritarian government backing you up, and that's what they have in China.
There's something this just really bothers me enormously. When I think about the devaluing of human beings, two things I want to share. One is that you look at the number of people in prisons, and I know this is a huge issue for you, Glenn. Mm-hmm. This country has 700 per 100,000 people are in prison. Most of those folks are black, people of color, detained and jailed for no valid reason. You look at Saudi Arabia, has 45 people per 100,000. I mean, this country has developed a whole economy around prisons. And the whole immigration thing I was mentioning earlier, I was working with a friend, an immigrant, and was at the White Center Homeland Security office, and it's a disgusting building. It's just millions of dollars, the marble in the bathrooms, and then the way they treat the people, being herded into a room and left for 45 minutes, and it's just very frightening.
Well, the United States has about 5% of the world population, and we have 25% of the people in prison in the whole world
Right.
in this country.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, what's that tell
That's a
you?
good way
Land
to
of the
put it.
free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're running pretty tight on time, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about the shredded safety net. And we have in this country the old AFDC is now temporary assistance to needy families, TANF, and that's very much in danger. Tell us something briefly about that.
Well, right here in our state, we had 5,500 people lost their income due to budget cuts, and that meant 1,300 children, not having any money. Those families have food stamps, and most of those are single mothers, women, and it's grim. So the homelessness is increasing rapidly. This year, I don't know how many more homeless we'll have in the state, but it's on the rise. We just have a really serious situation, and it really shows that our people are dispendable. The other side to that I think that's important is when you go to your legislators, and even those who claim to be concerned about budget cuts, genuinely concerned, I hear again and again, we can't do anything about this. You didn't vote the right way in the last election. There are numerous issues going on.
Yeah, voter-imposed limitations on taxes.
So Tim Eyman basically sealed everything up quite nicely. You have to have 2/3 majority of the House and both sides of the House.
Yeah, which means that
to
instead of
change
having
a
majority
tax.
rule, we have minority rule. A
We
minority of
sure
people
do.
can prevent democracy from happening, and that's what the people voted for. But they get stampeded into this because of fears.
It's exactly create a situation where you're in shock and you can manipulate the people to do.
Well, this is critical because what we were talking a little bit about this earlier. There's a concept I'm really passionate about, and it's a concept of differentiated leadership. So if I put myself in the legislature, I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to vote for those budget cuts, and it baffles me. How can you do that? What is that fear about? Are they going to kill me if I don't vote the right way? So differentiated leadership means the willingness to take a stand when it's really unpopular. You do it anyway because morally it's the right thing to do. And I realize that people on the far right have a different set of morals than I do. But I still am going to do what I think is right because I'm going to want to protect the people. So I think that until we have leaders who are willing to differentiate, things aren't going to change.
That fear thing that we were talking about was really ramped up after September 11 when the Patriot Act was granted through Congress. And what we had was, it was like hundreds of pages long. Congress didn't even read the thing, but these were ideas that had been on the shelf waiting to be implemented. Yeah. And there's this quotation from Milton Friedman from 1982 where he wrote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change." And that summarizes the shock doctrine approach. And then Alan Meltzer said, "Ideas are alternatives waiting on a crisis to serve as the catalyst of change." So with September 11, they said, oh, here's a chance to ram through all these things that the FBI has been wanting and the other people who are against freedom have been wanting, and they've just taken away all kinds of constitutional rights. Congress didn't even know what they were voting for, but they didn't dare not vote for this because they would have seemed unpatriotic or whatever, So this Patriot Act is that sort of thing, and it does a lot of things that are from, there are military manuals about how to do shock and awe and how to do torture and all this stuff. I mean, they've been doing these things. The shock and awe, there was a shock and awe report that the military had come up with in 1996 that was the basis for the 2003 attack on Iraq, and that report proposed the United States military should, quote, seize control of the environment and paralyze or so overload an adversary's perceptions and understanding of events so that the enemy would be incapable of resistance, unquote. So that's a shock and awe, you just overwhelm them. And that's what they're doing here, whether it's on economic things, they want to frighten the heck out of you with budget deficit stuff. And so Obama appoints right-wing people to
Right.
his deficit cutting commission, and they come back with right-wing proposals because that's who he appointed.
Yeah, I mean, look at
it's all the same stuff.
who he appointed for his outside economic advisor,
the-
the head of GE.
Yeah.
And GE's made hundreds of millions of dollars profit and haven't
Yeah.
paid any taxes.
Right, right. So that's what we're getting, and so it's really a bipartisan
Oh, yeah.
thing, part of the culture of people who are on top,
Right.
and it just alienates people on the bottom. We could talk about torture. That's part of it. It's in the book. It's in the governmental documents where they actually are promoting torture, and you see
It's
torture
the same kind
come
of-
up
it's the
over and
same
over
kind
again
of
in
thinking,
Chile,
yeah.
and at Abu Ghraib, and throughout Iraq, and
Right
this-
here.
and
Bradley
and
Manning
and
is certainly.
yeah, where the guy who believes in freedom of speech and freedom of the press so much that he allegedly leaked documents to WikiLeaks, and the government is torturing him, and the public says, "Oh well, so what?"
Right,
You know.
right.
Yeah, it's just amazing. I want to talk briefly about the U.S. economic crisis since 2007. You know, the Congress and the executive branch have been deregulating banks and deregulating Wall Street and letting them do all they wanted, and they did all these screwy, you know, collateral default swaps and all this kind of wheeler-dealer casino-style
Right.
gambling on Wall Street, and then they crash the economy, but they get rewarded for it,
Right.
and that deregulation is part of this whole thing. And there's not been remedies that deal with the problem. It sort of got brushed aside.
And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I don't want people watching this program to think that there's nothing we can do. I
Yeah.
think
Right.
we need to look at what's going on in Wisconsin. We need to look at what's
Yeah.
going on in Cairo. We need
Yeah.
to look at around the world.
And right
the
here.
people are here
yeah.
in Washington State.
Yeah.
There were 11,000 people
Yeah.
in Olympia
Yeah.
not long ago.
So
People are rising up and realizing their own power, and that's the main way you stop this kind of
right.
stuff.
And then this is the hinge that gets us into the last few minutes of the program, where we look at solutions, where people who do connect the dots and see what's going on, because part of what they do to overwhelm people is to keep people ignorant,
Right.
and have people feel like you're powerless.
Right.
But when you get 11,000 people to march on the state capitol here in Olympia,
Right.
we realize, hey, we're not powerless. And the people in Egypt figured that out. People in Tunisia figured that out. And those were partly economic-based things. The people were being squeezed by their economies. It wasn't just democracy.
Right,
It was,
no.
It was a
It was
fair
primarily-
economy. It
Yeah,
was a fair
economic.
economy
Yeah.
that they wanted.
Yeah.
And that democracy is part of that. And we need both here, and we don't have either one here. So if people know what's going on, and if they can connect the dots, as we're trying to do here, it really gives us ways to do that. So we're hoping people who are watching the program will say, "Oh, I didn't see it this way before. This is interesting. Oh, now I get it." Can we talk some more about these dots that you want to connect, or remedies for empowerment? I know we talked about some of these on the phone. You talked about people being able to connect with each other.
Well, what I'm seeing that is heartening is a lot of groups coming together. And we were sitting the other night at a meeting called with Move to Amend. And it was wonderful. Pretty soon there were folks coming in from a local union, some other students from Washburn. We had just different groups showing up, uncut, different folks. And I think this is what's really exciting, because people were all on the same page and really excited about working together. Feels stronger, much stronger than in past years. And those connections are really important. We have far more in common than we had a year ago. And I think Citizens United is an interesting thing, as people really understand the reason that all these things are happening, and that they're so affecting our economy negatively. As you see people in your community losing jobs, see people who aren't able to go to school, having a student stand up at a local town meeting and talk about my roommate's unemployed, my other roommate is working 10 hours a week, and I was just laid off as a legislative aide. You know, in a few sentences, I had tears in my eyes. Our young people don't have an easy road ahead.
Right.
So all of us need to be supporting each other.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's past time for more people in the streets. It's one of the few things that gets their attention. And a number of years ago, I talked to Jim McDermott about, I wondered why he hadn't come out against the sanctions forcefully. And he said, give me 100,000 people in the streets and I'll do it.
Yeah.
We need to force the politicians to do it, because it's the people in the street, plus in Wisconsin, it was the Democratic members of the legislature who left the state
Right.
to keep it from happening. We need the people in the parties, and we need the people in the street together to force the issue. These people, God didn't make them in charge.
Right.
We let them get in
Yes.
charge,
Yeah.
and we need to stop them from being in charge.
You remind me that we live right here in Olympia, and I think what's really important is I can go and talk to my legislators. Different than at the federal level, I can talk to any legislator. I'm not limited to just my representatives. I've been doing more and encourage people to do that. Call. There's a hotline, 1-800-562-6000. Follow the bills. There's way too many of them, but some of them are critical. And we need to support people in education. We need to support healthcare, and we need to keep bugging legislators about why they're voting a certain way. One group, I really like what they're doing. You do flyers. Put flyers up when they don't vote the right way and plaster the community with it.
Right. There's a lot that can be done, and people connecting with each other is part of a way to avoid that powerlessness that otherwise gets stuck on us. I want to thank Larry Kirshner and Molly Gibbs. I want to thank the folks who've been watching. This TV program has been trying to connect the dots between George W. Bush's shock and awe war against Iraq and the oppressive U.S. occupation of Iraq, and the political aftermath of 9/11, and the recent Wall Street and banking crash, and the ongoing economic crisis, and Wisconsin's politicians, and the current federal budget crisis, and efforts to privatize everything they can get their hands on. All of these dots need to be connected, and I think we're onto something. If we can pull back the curtain, like at the end of the Wizard of Oz movie, and see there's a guy back there pulling levers and trying to intimidate and frighten people, that's part of our remedy. Naomi Klein's 2007 book, The Shock Doctrine, is part of what we need. The radical free marketeers are promoting more of the same policies that got us into the mess that we're in. We need to stop that. They see militarizing everything as the solution. We've got to stop that. They see cutbacks in the social programs as their solution. We've got to stop those cutbacks. We've got to make sure that people's needs come before private profits. We need to not let them impose austerity programs upon us like they've been doing in other countries. And we need to make sure the rich don't get richer, that we have some economic democracy and spread the wealth around. It's only fair. The gap between the United States' top 1% and the bottom 90% has been getting wider and wider for decades. So we need to work in a lot of ways. The Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation has a website, www.olympiafor.org. We have a phone number, 491-9093. We can connect people with information and resources and connect people with organizations working on things. If you're watching this TV program on a Thursday night, stay tuned for our documentary series, The Big Picture, which now follows when this program ends at 10 p.m. Thursday nights. This month's documentary is COINTELPRO, the FBI's War on Black America, and it documents the FBI's covert operations to disrupt the civil rights and racial justice movements from 1956 to 61, or to 71. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks. Set of theories, and they've been deregulating.
Right.
They deregulated the banks, so the banks could do all kinds of screwy things, which later ended up crashing our economy. And they've been trying to privatize Social Security, now trying to privatize Medicare, sell off state prisons,
Right.
sell off the state liquor stores in Washington State. And all over they've been using school vouchers, trying to push school
Right.
vouchers to undermine public education, and now they're trying to bust the unions. And then they do all these free trade things like NAFTA, the
Right.
North American Free Trade Agreement, and WTO, the World Trade Organization, to eliminate any ways for countries to protect their own industries or to protect worker rights or to take care of the environment. So like you say, they want to
Right.
strip away all that.
Because that's
Regulation.
that's interfering with the natural economic laws that are God-given somehow.
Yeah.
And we just need to get out of the way
Yeah.
of those.
So could we lay out some of the main points in Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine?
Oh,
What,
there's so many.
there's so many, and we'll get into them through the program. I wonder if we can just hit a couple here at the outset,
Yeah.
and then we'll fill in the gaps as we go.
Well, I was just thinking about Israel and the examples where she talks about how if there is any kind of disaster, then there's an opportunity. And that's a basic principle that she follows in terms of the Chicago Boys approach.
Crisis all have in common. In each case, a crisis, either real or contrived, was used as the excuse to impose preconceived agendas of radical right-wing economic policies upon our political and or our economic lives. In 2007, Naomi Klein published a powerful book called The Shock Doctrine, and we'll use the ideas from that and build upon them during this program. The book is 600 pages long, but very readable. A lot of substance, a lot of good information and insights, and she does an excellent job of connecting the dots between a lot of things that have gone on in the past few decades and are going on right now in today's newspaper headlines. The book explodes the myth that the global free market triumphed democratically. Naomi Klein's book exposes the thinking, the money trail, and the puppet strings behind world-changing crises and wars in the past 4 decades. The preferred method has been to use either natural crises or other severe crises caused by humans, and to exploit the suffering people and the nations by imposing radical free market policies upon them and stripping away the public sector and stripping away people's democratic rights. The Shock Doctrine book connects the dots and it explains the underlying ideology that drove a number of actions. The Chicago School of Economics, it's often referred to just as the Chicago School.
Yeah, it started, well, I think there's an Austrian economist named Hayek, and his ideas were taken up by Milton Friedman, and it suffused the University of Chicago or Chicago University School of Economics, and they have this basic belief that there are certain underlying immutable economic principles that will always occur unless people somehow interfere with them. And they think the 3 main ways that these economic ideas get interfered with is if the government creates social programs, if the government tries in any way to inhibit or regulate corporations, and if the government tries to own economic entities that could be owned by the private corporations. And so those 3 things together in one form or another, they think that's what interferes with the natural order of things. So their whole focus is to get rid of those 3 things.
And that's what we've been seeing
Right.
in this country and other countries
Right.
around the world. We've seen this as the government has sort of bought into that. Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. So here's the question. What do Wisconsin's Republican politicians, the political aftermath of 9/11, the Wall Street banking crash, and the federal budget, the radical free market ideology drove the Nixon and Kissinger coup that overthrew Chile's democracy in 1973. It drove the economic vultures who pillaged Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. It drove George W. Bush's 2003 war against Iraq. It drove Bush's negative actions in response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And that same free market ideology also underlies our nation's current financial crisis, underlies the Wisconsin governor's current mania for busting unions, and it underlies the Republicans' drive to privatize Social Security and Medicare. This same ideology has been driving a wider wedge between the rich and the poor. Extremely rich individuals and businesses have been getting richer than ever, while the middle class has been slipping and the people at the bottom end have been just devastated. So we're going to connect all these dots. There's a lot going on. We have a richly informative program, and we have two very well-informed and insightful guests who have read the book and are very much in touch with all of these issues. We have Molly Gibbs and Larry Kirshner. I'm happy to have both of you on the show. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we will be able to share a lot of information with the viewers. To start with, Larry, could you just outline the basic sense of this economic radical free market stuff, Milton Friedman and